Hello and welcome to UK Wildlife Podcast. I'm Neil Phillips,
I'm Victoria Hillman.
and we have with us.
Steven Allain.
So we've got Steve with us today. Steve is a herpetologist. Your background's in all sorts of things: great crystal newts, midwife toads, snake fungal disease, not viral disease as I keep calling it. Well, welcome to the show, first of all, Steve.
Yes.
That was good. I think we'll start with the podcast news.
Okay.
Let's have a look. Do you want to start with the social media stats, Vic?
Yeah, so we've got on our Facebook page, we've got 274 likes and 283 followers. And on Twitter, we're up to 172 followers. And a lot of interaction, certainly on Twitter, last couple of weeks. So thank you so much to everybody. And lots of really lovely positive comments about our last episode, which was about the wildlife photography. So thank you again, and keep the questions and comments and everything coming in. We do read them and try and respond to as many as we can.
I had a couple of follow-up questions on Twitter and Facebook, which we were able to answer, which was nice. Downloads still going well, up to 2,700. That's pretty good. I can't remember. We were over 2,000 last time. Numbers racking up. So thanks everyone for downloading, sharing the podcast. Hopefully we'll have a few more next month as well.
A couple of questions as well. One on ring flash, which through our Facebook page, which I actually answered. So hopefully that's helped out. And yeah, just lots of really positive feedback about the wildlife photography episode. Everyone seemed to really enjoy it, and lots of tips picked up from it. So
we shall move on to the news. I'll start with a bit of good news. Cool links or coal links. I heard it pronounced both ways. Apologies to the wrong one there. In Scotland, some of you might remember the infamous Trump golf course in Scotland where there was an SSSI, and it got so bad there. I think it was last year before, they actually removed the SSSI status because they destroyed it when they built the golf course. This really rare sand dune habitat in Scotland, and a similar thing was threatened to happen. A totally different billionaire this time, trying to take over a big chunk of Scotland, turn it into a golf course. But because the Trump golf course never delivered on the jobs and various other things, and environmental damage was seen as too severe, they've actually blocked planning permission for it. Hopefully that's the end of it. And a lot of people are now campaigning to try and get it given a more protected status, but not the SSSI's guarantee. But yeah, so a bit of good news. Well done to Bug Life and all the bodies up in Scotland involved in campaigning to get that stopped, because that was a good bit of work there. Not so good news on HS2, of course. That's been approved now. I'm sure you've seen on the news. And lots of environmental damage to come from that. That's a bit of a downer, that one. I believe you've got a story on beavers, Vic?
I have. It's a study that's come out. It was actually carried out by a team from University of Exeter, and quite topical given the amount of flooding that we've got going on at the moment. And it's basically beavers cut flood risks, clean rivers, and boost wildlife. It's basically what the study has shown. And they've been looking at the beavers down in Devon on the River Otter, and basically so that the wild beaver populations are reducing the impacts of floods, cleaning the river water, and boosting populations of fish, amphibians, and water voles. And the study's been done over 5 years. So that's a very good, positive news story about beavers, and something that I think would be definitely worth looking into going forward in various areas of the country, I think.
We'll have to have a look at cover the causes of flooding, because let's just say there appears to be a strong correlation between towns that are flooding in certain areas and grouse moors draining blanket bogs upstream of them.
And also building housing estates on floodplains.
Yes, there's that fantastic picture doing around at the moment, isn't there, of a piece of land with plan permission given and it's under 2 or 3 foot of water. Yeah, there's a lot of idiotic stuff like that going on. And for years, rivers have been canalised to try and make them hold more water and get the water down as quick as possible. But we're now realising the trick to stop flooding is to slow down the water when it's higher upstream and let it sort of come through gradually. I thought it was one story. It turns out it's 2 stories about the sparrowhawks being shot. I don't know if you guys have you two guys seen this in the news?
I haven't seen it, no.
No. The story broke I saw yesterday. A chap in Cowie in Stirlingshire, up in Scotland, shot a sparrowhawk with his air rifle. He's a pigeon fancier, so he was trying to protect his pigeon supposedly. Shot it, and he was given something that would definitely stop him doing it again, a £450 fine. And I thought it was the same story until I looked closer. Another chap in Portsmouth leant over his neighbour's fence. He used a catapult to kill a sparrowhawk sitting on his racing pigeon, He got a fine of £800, which is hardly a deterrent. So there's pigeon fanciers killing sparrowhawks. It's not exactly a secret. A lot of them hate sparrowhawk. There's also some chap in Colchester that's always moaning about the peregrines. There's a pair of peregrines in Colchester that always nest in the same place. They're almost got celebrity status in Colchester. He writes to the paper every year to moan about them, which is a bit depressing. In terms of stats, the stupidity of killing sparrowhawk is that a government study found that over half of each pigeon races, on average this is, pigeons go missing every year anyway. And most of them are sort of like hitting wires, windows, or just wandering off. I mean, look at your local town centre full of pigeons. And only 14% were killed by bird of prey like peregrines and sparrowhawks. So compared to how many they lose anyway, it's a tiny fraction. It just seems mad that they feel that they have to shoot or catapult things that other people enjoy. Strange, really. I don't know. I know they've got to protect their pets or whatever they want to refer to them as, but there's a nice, depressing news story for you.
Yeah. Should we move on to something happier?
Let's move on to something happier, yes.
Like
So,
frogs and toads.
frogs and toads. Yay! That's why we have Steve here. Now, we've got Pond Man here, that's me. We've got Frog Lady Vic. But yet we still decided to bring in the super amphibian expert, that is Steve Allain. How many scientific papers you published on reptiles and amphibians now, Steve?
Too many to count.
Yeah. I'm still working on my first one. In fact, I'm teaming up with Steve, hopefully to do something next year. We'll talk about that when we've done that or started it, I think.
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. So Steve is currently working on snake fungal disease in grass snakes. Did you want to talk a little bit about that first?
Sure.
Before we get on to the amphibians?
So yes, the snake fungal disease is an emerging infectious disease that affects snakes, hence its name. And it was first confirmed as being in Europe, especially here in the UK back in 2016. And I've been working on it since late 2018. And we're working on a population of grass snakes and trying to investigate the effects it has on their health, their mortality, as well as breeding success, so that sort of stuff. The disease has been known in the US for quite some time, and there it appears to affect different species of snakes differently. Obviously, the US has far more snake species than the UK does. We only have 3 native and 2 introduced species of snakes. And so I think there's something like 52 papers now published on snake fungal disease, which is also known as ophidiomycosis. And only 2 of those are, looking at things from a European point of view. So yeah, there's a lot to learn and a lot of work to be done. I'm looking forward to getting back out in the field this spring and summer to see what data I can collect to try and make sense of things. But before I did everything with snakes and with fungal diseases there, I did it all in amphibians before for a number of years. So looking at the amphibian chytrid fungus, so I did that. I've been working with midwife toads in the UK, so we've been studying a population in Cambridge since 2015. Started disease surveillance in 2016, and that's been ongoing since. And for my masters, I was working with chytrid fungus in Madagascar amphibians. For my undergrad, I was studying a local population of great crested newts and seeing how their microhabitat preferences differed during the breeding season between the sexes, because males and females prefer different habitats, and so by understanding them, you can effectively manage ponds in such a way that you increase breeding rates and therefore hopefully success, in order to mitigate building work nearby or whatever else if you're translocating newts into a pond, because unfortunately ponds aren't always in the state that amphibians like them to be in. They need to be established for quite some time, they need to be free of predators, they need to have a certain amount of macrophyte cover, and I'm sure most of you will recognize a good wildlife pond from a bad one. So trying to understand what newts liked in terms of their pond preferences, I hoped that I could help produce some guidance or at least advise on how to manage ponds better for newts. But unfortunately, it never got that far. But if you want to know more about newts, we can cover those in detail at another time. But always tweet me, and I'm always happy to answer.
So I'm sure we'll try and squeeze a bit on newts, but we're going to concentrate on the frogs and toads first tonight, I think. So shall we start with perhaps the most widespread, but certainly most common in gardens, is going to be the common frog, isn't it?
This is Rhino temporaria, yeah.
Or temporary frog, I believe it's called outside of the UK, isn't it?
It is. I know that the Dutch and the Germans call it the grass frog, but yeah, this is the issue with common names, is that they vary between countries, but also within counties or villages, etc., which makes them completely useless if you travel a bit. But they are very widespread, arguably our most common species in the UK, and anybody who's anybody has probably seen them at some point in their life, probably in their childhood when they had tadpoles in their classroom or in a garden pond. And yeah, they are one of the species that produce the characteristic frog spawn that everybody's familiar with at this time of year. Well, from this time of year going into, early spring. It depends on a number of factors as to when and why frogs spawn.
They're usually the first to find the ponds, I believe, too, aren't they, out of all the species? They although they do have some loyalty to their breeding ponds, they tend to wander a bit as well more.
Well, I think when we moved into the house that we're in now, when we moved in, our garden was grass and decking, and that was it. It was devoid of any wildlife. And I built the pond. I dug the pond the first year we were in, and within a couple of days of filling it with water from the water butts, went out, had a look, and had a little frog sitting in there, and has been with us ever since. So yeah, they're there, and they will find it.
Fingers crossed. I should have some spawn soon.
Yeah, not seen mine yet.
No,
not seen them yet.
So the important thing to note with frogs is that you're both perfectly demonstrated that that they're in the environment, and there's this misconception with amphibians because they have this double life where they breed in the water, they live on land, that as soon as it comes to spring, frogs live in ponds. They do, but they spend a lot of their time in the terrestrial environment as well, which is why if you dig a pond, they'll gravitate towards it. And a lot of people often ask me why they don't find frogs in their ponds that have been established for quite some time. And unfortunately, in some places, there just aren't enough ponds in that environment, particularly in urban centres, to act as stepping stones to allow frogs to disperse and find new ponds.
I have to admit, like with you saying that, Steve, it's really interesting because when we moved here, to the best of our knowledge, we're the only garden on the estate that actually has a pond. And it, obviously it didn't have one for the 13 years or whatever it was built before we moved in. As far as I'm aware, there aren't any other estates, or there's no other ponds in the area, but we've still got we've had 4 or 5 different frogs now that come to our garden, and they spawned last year as well.
Maybe they disperse. I don't know if we know this, Steve. Do they disperse further as juveniles, because they don't return to the pond until they're 2 or 3 years old, I believe it is?
No, of course, yeah. They leave the pond as a froglet, disappear off into the environment for a couple of years, and then return to water to breed. So they can travel up to 1 kilometre or more, in that time, depending on the conditions in the environment. Obviously, a semi-natural habitat is going to be more permeable to a frog than an urban one. And I think that one of the things that aids frogs moving around and finding new habitats is connectivity of gardens, gardens to semi-natural wild spaces, give them corridors to move through. In terms of your frogs, Vic, they may have been in environment and breeding somewhere, in just a hollow, not exactly a pond, but somewhere where rainwater collected long enough for tadpoles to metamorphose and then disperse into the environment. I'm sure you guys are aware that if you fill a pond in, give it a couple of years, and frogs will return thinking there's going to be a pond there, because those are the ones that left the pond as not as a froglet a couple of years ago. Remember what that pond is from when they were a tadpole, and they come back and they go, oh no, the pond's gone, and then just sit there with an angry look on their face.
They do go looking for other ponds though, because my nan had a pond that only ever had toads. Like a nice sized pond, it's good 4 meters by 2 meters at least, and she always had toads. And then bam, one year literally sort of 30 or 40 frogs just turned up. So I reckon someone locally filled in their pond and they just gravitated towards that, because they smell the water. Don't they smell the water?
They do, so the frogs can detect certain species of algae in the ponds that let them know that there's a pond there. I'm not sure of the ins and outs. There are scientific papers out there and there's information around, but yeah, frogs can essentially smell water that let them know that ponds are there.
They'll avoid ponds with fish and newts even as well, won't they?
They will, yes. So frogs, they produce thousands of offspring per a clump of spawn, and so that's a great food source for newts. So smooth, palmate, and great crescent newts are all voracious predators of frog spawn, and tadpoles, and fish exactly the same. If you find amphibians in a fish pond, they're most likely going to be toads, for the reason that toads are toxic, their spawn's toxic, their tadpoles are toxic, and so it affords it some level of protection to predators. But obviously, if you've only got one, string of toad spawn and thousands of fish in a pond, it's still going to disappear because not all of those fish are going to encounter and experience to learn that eating that toad tadpole is a bad idea.
So we've got, like, with my parents' ponds that I've been working on for the last few years, the main pond that we've had since, I grew up there, so since I was a child, we do have fish in it, but the fish are only in one end of it. They can't actually physically get into the other end of the pond.
Okay.
So the frogs and toads breed in that other end of the pond, as do the newts, and a lot of them. But we have frogs, toads, and newts all in that smaller end of the pond, which is, much better for wildlife. And then we've got the big fish, which are in the other side of the pond, but they can't get into the end where the frogs and toads are. So we've managed to kind of find a balance that works. We have since put in another pond, a second one, which doesn't have fish in it, and that is going to be more kind of for wildlife. But I mean, in our pond, we didn't have, for years and years and years, I don't think we ever had toad spawning in it. And then a couple of years ago, they spawned in it, and checking on it today, they've actually spawned in it again this year, which is great. And there was a little toad sitting in there.
So the tadpoles, talking of fish and newts eating them, it's important to note from a freshwater ecology perspective, the tadpoles are extremely important for so many creatures. I mean, dragonfly nymphs, diving beetle larvae. I don't think it's a coincidence. A lot of the Ditiscus, the great diving beetles, their young appear in spring when the pond is full of tadpoles. I don't think it's a coincidence they're in there, and they hoover them up. Well, they hoover them up. They actually stab them with their fangs and suck them dry. There's a lovely thought for you, Vic.
Nice.
Anything that's predatory is going to be eating them, basically. And,
no, it's the reason why frogs play the numbers game.
Yeah.
Only 2 of them need to make it to adulthood for that population to remain stable, yet they produce thousands of young. They don't have any level of parental care. They just spawn, disperse into the environment, and let the tadpoles fend for themselves. So there's high levels of predation are important, as you say, for the foundation of the rest of the ecosystem. Going back to what you were saying, Vic, toads rarely spawn in garden ponds in my experience. Not just because of the potential for fish predators, although that doesn't seem to bother them too much, but it's the complexity of the aquatic vegetation. So there are sites that I've surveyed where I've seen toads in amplexus, in a breeding embrace. I've seen tadpoles, but I've never seen their spawn. And the reason being is they like to hide it amongst aquatic vegetation. I imagine it's something to do with the fact it comes out as a string as opposed to a clump. So the female needs some way to anchor it to be able to help it be laid, as opposed to the clump that you can just push out and just leave there to float away once it's absorbed the water and stuff. So yeah, the toad spawn tends to be somewhat more concealed than frog spawn. If you have a frog spawn in the pond, it's quite obvious it's there. Toad spawn, not so much.
Yeah,
I think with this one, because like a couple of years ago, we went about 5 years without having didn't even see a frog, no frog spawn or anything. So I said, right, just need to overhaul the pond, put some more vegetation in it. That smaller end is now really for wildlife. That's how it's been done. There's a lot more vegetation in it. Like checking today, there's an awful lot of toad spawn, and it's just wrapped around all the vegetation in there. So I don't know, maybe I've just got the magic touch and they like my ponds.
And of course, they're long-lived toads, aren't they? So even if they only have spawned successful once in their 25 years, is it 25 years, I believe, Steve?
Yeah, they can live a long time, yeah. It may even be more. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but yeah, this is the one thing that people are always astonished that reptiles and amphibians can live for quite some time. As far as we're aware, the longest great crested newt in the wild was about 20 years old. And yeah, for frogs and toads, they can easily do that plus some more. Reptiles, it's even more than that. But yeah, no, they're very long-lived. And as long as, they're able to navigate all of the challenges that life throws at them, they should be able to, survive for quite, to quite a ripe old age, and hopefully breed a few times during their lifetime to keep their species going.
Yeah, so staying with toads, I suppose we should talk about the differences between the two. I mean, the basic one is frogs have a smooth skin, doesn't it? And toads have a knobbly skin. We won't get into the whole are toads and frogs really separate groups, because once you get out of Britain, it kind of falls apart, the whole definition of frog or toad.
It does. I think the easiest way is to tell frogs and toads apart in the UK. If you look at them face on, frogs tend to have they look like they're wearing a mask around their eyes. So they've got those dark patches behind their eyes that go down to their eardrums that form almost triangles. Toads don't have that. Toads, the pupil is black, that's surrounded by almost a copper-coloured disc, and then they also have their poison glands, the parotid glands, on the back of their head, sort of where the neck region is. Frogs are all sorts of colours. This time of year, females can be bright red. Males tend to be an olive green colour, maybe brown, whereas toads are generally a light brown colour, but they can change in response to temperature and all sorts of other stimuli. So, those are sort of visual differences. Also, when it comes to finding one on the land, frogs hop, toads tend to crawl. So yeah, there's a number of ways of telling them apart, and a number of people often get them confused, which is, if you don't see enough of them to be able to distinguish them side by side, completely understand. Once you know what you're doing, you can never make that mistake again. It's like riding a bicycle.
Yeah, once you get your eye in, they're quite easy. Just to sort of reiterate what we've kind of said already, so common frogs are a species of ponds, smaller ponds, fish-free ponds, and temporary water bodies to some degree, as long as they last till June, July time. And toads you tend to find in the bigger ponds with fish and even lake. So, well, perhaps maybe talk about courtship. You can hear frogs making that noise, that the males make a noise that's best described as like a motorbike in the distance, as one description I heard. And that's a call to the females, I believe, isn't it?
So I often play the calls of frogs and toads to people, and they often get them the wrong way round. People think that frogs have this, this high-pitched squeal, and toads are more guttural, but it's actually the other way around. And so, yes, males are calling to females, but they're also sizing each other up, sort of like how bird song is a very similar thing. Establishing territories, males are sizing each other up, and females are listening out for that one note, or that bit of tune that indicates that the male that's making it is the best one for her to mate with. And so most frog species call to attract a mate. It seems to work. Some of the examples that I think on top of my head where they don't is where in the tropics where they live around waterfalls, so like torrent frogs, fruit flag waving frogs, where because the background noise is so loud, if they were to call, they wouldn't be heard. So they have other modes of communication, such as waving with their feet, or nodding and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, they call around the ponds. Around this time of year, maybe give it another couple of weeks when it gets a bit warmer. If you go down to a pond, even in the day, if there's enough frogs there, you'll be able to hear them calling. Toads tend to call more at night. This is the thing when it comes to courtship, in toads especially, they have a number of basic rules that identify as females, and those are: is it in or near a pond? Is it silent, and is it moving? And if all three of those are ticked, it must be a female toad. So toads can often think that frogs are their own species, I've seen them grappled onto great crested newt, and they've had to free the newt because it's got a toad riding it. I've seen pictures online of toads attached to American bullfrogs. I've seen them attached to goldfish. There's a site I wanted to just outside of Cambridge that's a crematorium, and sometimes you find toads attached to all sorts of litter that's been left behind, like plastic bottles or plastic flowers that have blown in the wind and landed it in the pond. Yeah, they aren't the cleverest of animals, but this system clearly works. Male toads, if another male grabs a male, they'll make a high-pitched squeal to let that male know that, sorry mate, I'm a bloke, let go. And so
they sometimes make that when we pick them up, don't they, as well, that you hear that squeak.
Of course, yeah. So if you've ever picked up toads, part of a toad patrol to prevent them from being hit by cars, or to help them get through obstacles, because unfortunately humans are great at dividing habitat and fragmenting ponds and wildlife from it. You pick them up and they start to make this high-pitched squeal because they think that you're a male that's trying to mate with them, essentially, which is quite funny at times. Frogs, they do a similar thing, but it's not to the same degree as toads. I think that their system for finding a mate is more based on their call, whereas toads will jump onto females on her way to the pond, as opposed to frogs where they wait till they're there.
Yeah, because I was reading the other day that toads don't call like frogs. Really. Like I say, it's more just that high-pitched squeak. Wait, get off me.
It is, and you can go down to some ponds at night and hear toads calling, but it tends to be a solitary male or two that hasn't managed to partner up with a female on the way to the pond, or in that immediate area before everything kicks off.
Yeah, because you talk about them gripping things. I remember reading as a kid, and I have seen a couple of pictures on Twitter of them where unfortunately they've grabbed a koi carp by the gills around the head, and they've actually suffocated this koi carp, much to the annoyance of the owners. So
we've actually had to remove toads from the koi carp in the pond before. Both survived. We managed to get them early enough, but we've had to try and remove them from the gills where they're hooked on.
If you've ever picked up a toad and it's latched onto you thinking you're a female, those little guys are determined and are hard to get off. But
Yeah,
you can see that the grip obviously works, and it happens with frogs sometimes, but mostly in toads that you have these mating balls where you have this one toad that's in amplexus with a female, and all these other males will bundle on her and try to fertilize her eggs. The reason for this is that with frogs and toads, the males tend to breed every year. The metabolic investment to produce a couple of drops of sperm is nothing in comparison to the metabolic investment is to produce eggs. And so, as you said, Neil, if a frog or a toad breeds successfully once in its lifetime, that's great. Maybe it can get another shot later on down the line if it lives long enough. But yeah, that investment means that there are cycles of toad and frog breeding activity at different sites. So some of the sites I monitor where we have like a 7-year-long data set, you can see this, where for the first year there was quite a low count in frogs and toads, and then it reaches a peak about 3 years later, drops again, and it's now back on the way up again. When people say that the frogs and the toads have disappeared from their area, I'm skeptical sometimes, because it may just be an artifact of that fluctuation of populations and breeding.
Yeah.
Or it may be because of more landscape, larger scale sort of things that are going on that are disrupting the breeding cycle, or the activities such as roads and all sorts of bits and pieces. So you sometimes have to take this with a pinch of salt and evaluate what's going on to fully understand what's going on with frogs and toads.
As I said, the pond, one of the ponds that I survey it's a really big pond actually. It's a massive one, and you go, like, some years I've seen 6, 7 mating balls of toads. It's a toad breeding pond, and you see them in some I've had. There's been one female with 13 males on her. She was actually dead by the time I got there, but they didn't give up. They were certainly determined little toads. They weren't giving up, even though she was clearly dead and had been dead a while. And then you go back the next year and it's all pairs and there's no mating balls. So like you said, there's such a big fluctuation. You need to see the patterns, but you need a good data set to be able to see the patterns.
Oh no, definitely.
Yeah. So those not familiar with a mating ball, it's basically what happens is one female gets the attention of one male, and then another, and they all sort of bundle round her. And quite often she ends up not being able to get to the surface and drowns, and so do some of the males in the middle, and it's all rather unfortunate.
I have a video, so I'll post the video onto our Twitter and Facebook page so people can have a look and see what it's like. And it's got the noises actually that the males are making as well, so you
that's cool.
can hear the noises in the ball. There's one.
I'm on a mission this year to film the sound of frogs and toads mating this year. I've got a couple of tip-offs. We shall see what happens.
You need to come down here, Neil, and I can take you to the perfect place.
If only I could get that far. Maybe we should talk about the other native anuran.
There's 2 other native anurans, but
of course, yes.
So we'll leave the pool frog out just because at the moment there's only 2 sites in Norfolk and you're unlikely to see it. The other native anuran is the natterjack toad, which again very range restricted, likes sandy dune systems. So there's a few populations on the Sefton coast in North Wales, on the Norfolk coast, some down south as well, because they also like sandy heathland as well. There's been a population that was reintroduced into sandy in Bedfordshire. There's historic records of them all across the UK, so that there's records of them from central Cambridge, from the Essex coast, Kent. Basically, if there's coastline, if there was heathland there, if there was sand there was natterjack toads. But unfortunately, we've come along and developed them into golf courses or holiday resorts, and in the process, stopped those processes that maintain the dune system and the health of the ponds there for natterjack toads to breeding, and have caused them to decline as a result. Common toads don't tend to like the same habitats just because natterjacks lay their eggs in extremely ephemeral sandy pools that dry out very quickly, and the tadpoles only have a couple of weeks to metamorphose and get out of Dodge before it completely dries up.
Yeah, I've read a really good article on it, and my understanding was that before we fully understood how their ecology works, we kept noticing that most years the natterjack toad ponds dried out, so they dug them out deeper to make sure they breed successfully every year, and it was colonized by common toads then, because they could live in it. And it turns out is it something like once every 5 years natterjacks need successful?
Yes. So this was work that was done by, if I'm not mistaken, Trevor Beebe And yes, so I think at the time there was only like a 5-year data set or something. It might have been 8 years. It was only small. So there were these number of desiccation events, which then meant that all the tadpoles and the metamorphs passed away when the pond dried out. And so, as you say, people dug them larger and deeper in an attempt to try to prevent them drying out as quickly. And in the end, they unfortunately made them just that little bit bigger that common toads could successfully colonize them, and accidentally pushed the natterjacks out. And yeah, with a much larger data set, we've been able to see that yes, natterjacks have these catastrophic desiccation events, but as long as they don't happen too frequently, they're able to at least remain stable.
Yes, but they rely on basically 1 year every few years being really good, and it just keeps them. That's what you evolved to cope with in the dune system, isn't it? Because that's what happens, I guess. They're famous for running as well, aren't they?
They are, yes. And so I've seen natterjacks once at the reintroduction site in Sandy. And when we went in late April, unfortunately, we were too late to catch the breeding. We still saw some toads. And we only saw two male natterjacks, and they're pretty sure there was only a couple in that area anyway, because most of them have moved off. But they make one hell of a noise for a small little toad. They're probably the loudest amphibian we have in the UK, bar marsh frogs. It's crazy to think that we were at this pond. It had been identified by the rangers that were natterjack toads there earlier in the day. We were sitting there with our torches off in the dark, waiting for them to call. We were probably there for about half an hour or so. We'd lost our motivation. It was getting cold, so we started to head back to the car park. And then about halfway back, the male started calling, so we rushed back to the pond. With the chorus, we was expecting a dozen or so toads, and then once we got back to the pond, there was just these two males there just going at it, facing each other off. It was an experience that I'll never forget, but they surprised me for sure.
Well, cool little things. They've got that lovely yellow stripe down their back, which is the distinctive feature, I guess. A bit smaller, but I just love the fact that the tadpoles, I think certainly once they got their rear legs, and possibly just before, they have their yellow stripe forms before they even turn into frogs, which I think is rather nice. It's like I'd love to photograph one day.
And each one's stripe is unique and can be used to recognise individuals, through space and time, because they're not always straight. Some of them are a little bit zigzaggy in different places. And yeah, if you can get a dorsal photo of a natterjack toad, you can do recapture studies, and as long as you recapture that same individual at some point in the time, you'll be able to say, oh yeah, look, we'll be called Bob again, whoever.
I think maybe we better cover your specialist subject, as it were, the alien toad.
The midwife toad.
Yes.
So yes, good old midwife toads. So as I mentioned earlier, started out studying a population in Cambridge in 2015. We were searching for them for 2-3 years and followed all sorts of leads. So they're near in the area where they are. There's an old midwife training facility where people also used to go and give birth, etc. And we thought, okay, maybe this is the place that these toads are at, because for a long time before the 70s, before Clear Blue came along with the lateral flow pregnancy tests, African clawed frogs were used as a pregnancy test. And so in 1926, two British guys realized that if you take the urine of a pregnant woman and inject it into a female African clawed frog, if that frog ovulates within 24 hours, the woman is pregnant. The reason being is that the frogs use the same hormones that we use and stimulates ovulation. So they were shipped all around the world, spreading disease and all sorts of other bits and pieces along the way. And we thought maybe that these midwife toads that we'd heard about were actually these, in a pond on the site of this now old people's home. So we contacted them, and unfortunately there wasn't a pond on the site, and there never was. So, that ruled that situation out. So then we looked at the area on a map where we thought they were, counted up all the houses, and did a massive mail drop and got some responses for some people. And that's how the study started. And since then, we've had a growing community engagement with the residents of Cambridge. Some of them have young kids. They've got involved. They've brought their friends home from school to come see the toads. They've done show and tell at school, or whatever else with the project. Everybody's happy to let a couple of nutters in the back garden for a few hours every now and again when the weather's nice, which I think is great. But they also keep us well fed with copious amounts of tea, biscuits, and coffee, and cake, and whatever else that they can.
Which is where you go, really.
Oh yeah, of course. It's not for the midwife toads. It's for the free tea and biscuits.
Yeah, you're a student. You know how to get your free tea and biscuits.
Exactly. But they make us work for it, because the toads aren't easiest to find. So me and my colleague Mark Goodman, we developed a way to find them, which has now been downloaded from ResearchGate over over 1,000 times, or at least read. And yeah, essentially, they like to hide in small cracks and crevices. As a toad, they're only the size of a 50p piece. They're quite small, and the males make this high-pitched beeping sound to attract a mate, as well as to, size each other up, claim territories, all that sort of stuff. And like with anything, you get near it and they go stum. So we got a recording of one using a Frog Life Dragon Finder app, and would play it when we were near where we thought the toad was. And obviously, the toad trying to get on with a female, trying to court her, would call back, trying to tell this male to go shove it, and would reveal where he was. So our capture rate went through the roof after we discovered that. The bad thing is that only works for males. Females don't call. They tend to be quite cryptic. Midwife toads get their name because the males carry their eggs around, which is quite weird for an amphibian. They tend to lay them in water, or at least somewhere damp. So yeah, so they breed terrestrially. They live their whole life terrestrially, apart from the point when they're a tadpole. And so they tend to breed about May time up until August. And the male will take the eggs and go sit somewhere that's damp, dark, and warm, and incubate the eggs, as it were, for 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the weather and the environmental conditions. And then when those eggs are ready to hatch, he will find a pond or a body of water, deposit the eggs, and the tadpoles will hatch out and go swim away.
How does he carry the eggs around?
So the eggs are laid on, the best way to explain it is that the eggs are laid on this elastic band, and basically when the female lays the eggs, he fertilizes them and then wraps them around his own legs. And I've heard it best described as trying to put on your trousers without using your hands. And when you see the transfer of eggs, I haven't seen it myself, but there's plenty of videos on YouTube. It looks just like that. So he'll go off and incubate those. When you're looking for males underneath paving slabs or plant pots or whatever else in these people's gardens, those are the areas that he's guarding, because he knows they're going to be good for taking care of his eggs there. A, because it's damp, dark, and warm, but B, there's no predators there, and there's probably food nearby as well. We've done lots of work with the Cambridge population. So far, we've found out they're disease-free, and we've got some samples that need to go to the lab sometime soon from a few other populations to see if they're disease-free as well. We expect them to be, just because midwife toads on continental Europe, where they're native to, have suffered huge declines in recent years because of disease. And you'd expect similar declines here in the UK if disease was present, and we haven't seen those declines. So fingers crossed they're disease-free. And I'm currently undertaking a project with a group of people to determine where all of the UK's midwife toad populations came from. So we're going out to these populations all around the UK, taking some DNA samples, and essentially doing the same thing that Ancestry DNA or 23andMe would do. And we're tracing back these lineages of toads to try and find out where they originated from way back when they were first introduced.
Oh, excellent stuff. So Vic, I believe we've got a few questions for Steve to answer. And
we have.
And yourself.
So we've actually got 3 questions. So we're going to put 2 of them to Steve. So the first one is from John Campbell on Facebook, and he's actually asked, what effect does gritting have at this time of year on our amphibians?
Okay, so although gritting is seen as a mandatory exercise to try to prevent roads icing up and therefore crashes and God knows what else happen when motorists are trying to get home from work or take the kids to school or whatever, it can have disastrous effects on our amphibians. So their skin is very permeable. They use it to breathe, they use it to uptake water, to uptake ions, all these sorts of bits and pieces. And therefore, if you add salt to the environment for a freshwater animal, it can have disastrous effects. There are studies that show when toads come into contact with salt on a road, they'll turn around and avoid it. The reason being is that it dries out their skin, and they need their skin to be moist to be able to breathe, for it to function. It's their most important organ. And so by impeding its ability to do its job, you're threatening the life of the animal. Toads tend to be quite hardy. Frogs are a bit more sensitive. And, newts as well, they're highly susceptible. So that's why you don't find any aquatic amphibians that live in marine environments, is because they'd simply just dry out due to osmosis. Some species have some level of ability to be hardy against brackish water, but most of them tend to avoid it at all costs, just because to them it's a death sentence.
Cool, thank you very much. And it should actually probably say, like, a lot of the gritting that takes place, certainly in this country, it's all done with rock salt, which is why Steve was mentioning about the salt side of things. It is actually rock salt that they tend to put. And there was actually, I found a couple of things where there's somebody in Wales where they've had a big problem with this and they're seeing declines, and he's actually suggesting that instead of gritting with rock salt, that they use sawdust instead, because it would be better for the amphibians, because you're not putting that rock salt into the environment.
It's also an issue for where there's tunnels under roads to mitigate building works for wildlife, etc., because engine oil and rock salt tends to to accumulate underneath there with the rain. And so for amphibians that are passing through, they'll encounter those toxins and uptake them in their skin and unfortunately suffer the consequences. Whereas animals such as reptiles and mammals that are more hardy and have a much tougher outer skin tend to do far better. With rock salt on roads, it's not just the amphibians that are being affected, but if that water runs off into the local environment, the salt can affect the salinity of soils, of ponds, of all sorts of bits and pieces. So lots of animals and plants can be affected. Lots of people use amphibians as an indicator because they're the ones that you can see this changing most visually.
Yeah, I think frogs are the first things to suffer under acid rain, aren't they? Weirdly, before the fish. You wouldn't think it'd be that way around, but apparently the frogs die first. They're the canaries in the coal mine.
Yeah, of course, it all, again, comes down to the changing of the water chemistry, making it more acidic. And yeah, unfortunately, because they're highly susceptible, they are, as you say, the canaries in the coal mine.
And then we had another one, and it's not, this has actually come from several different people, and it's kind of a discussion that was going on Twitter, and it's, something that I've seen this year as well. So kind of any thoughts on why in areas that generally frogs have always spawned before toads, and quite a bit before toads, like several weeks before maybe the toads have spawned. This year in particular, a lot of people are seeing that the toads are spawning now, but there's no sign of any frog spawn yet. So it's kind of flipped. It's the other way around. There seems to be quite a lot of people that are seeing that. There's a lot of people that have said, we've seen, the toads are spawning now, and normally our frogs would be spawning about now, and then the toads wouldn't be spawning until later. And I know checking one of my ponds today, we have toad spawn in it, but no frog spawn. And normally the toads around here would normally be spawning in about a month's time. So, they're about a month earlier than they have been normally.
So I think there's a number of reasons that are contributing to this. One is the fact that we've had a wet, mild winter, which has potentially thrown off the amphibians slightly. Two is that they don't have calendars or watches, so they can't tell what the date is or what the time is. And so to be able to queue up their time to breed, they use environmental cues such as day length and temperature and all those sorts of bits and pieces. And toads, more so than frogs, are highly reliant on the lunar phase as well to synchronize their breeding. So I think one of the reasons why we're seeing toads breeding before frogs this year is these combination of factors of a mild winter, appropriate weather, and the lunar phase all being ideal for toads to breed, so much so that although it's slightly early, they think it's the right time to come out. And so to them, it could be the end of March. As we all know, it's only the end of February. But again, to them, they don't know any better.
It is really interesting, seeing a lot of, so obviously there's a lot of reports. Interestingly, there was an awful lot of reports of frog spawn that came in after the weekend where Storm Dennis hit. And, I know the frogs that started appearing in one of the ponds that I keep an eye on. They were there over the weekend of Storm Dennis, but didn't spawn. And then that week after Storm Dennis, there was a lot of records suddenly start appearing where people have said we've got frog spawn. So they've obviously picked what we thought was a horrific weekend of weather. And for a lot of people, it has been, to be fair, obviously a very good weekend for the frogs.
No, so some of them got caught out a couple of years ago when we had the beast from the east. So we had that nice, mild, warm weather, and then everything got really cold very quickly. And so everything came out to breed, reptiles and amphibians alike. And then it got very cold, ponds froze over, and a lot of animals died. And so that year was a bumper year for what is known as winter kill, which is where, because ponds are fully frozen over, they deoxygenate quickly, and the animals inside suffocate essentially. And so I was at one of the residents in Cambridge, in their garden, one of the people who we monitor her pond for midwife toads. And she called me up, and I went round there and helped her clean the pond out. And she's only got a very small pond. We took out about 35 dead frogs, and it was just a dead frog soup. And during the process, I may have screamed like a little girl, embarrassingly, because it turns out that one of these frogs wasn't dead at all and was just chilling with his dead mate. So, put him in this black sack, and it hopped out towards me. And that's when the scream was let out, because I thought a zombie frog was coming to get me. I will mention now, because it's a nice segue, that if you do find any dead toads, frogs, newts, or any wildlife in your garden or local area, please report it through the Garden Wildlife Health Project. Just Google Garden Wildlife Health. There's advice there. You can report it, and then if need be, or if it's necessary, the vet team there will request a carcass if you still have it. And hopefully that can help us keep an eye on all sorts of nasties that could be out in the wild and affecting wildlife without us even knowing it. It's a nice surveillance monitoring system that relies heavily on citizen scientists, particularly when they realise that things aren't going the way they should be in the gardens with all sorts of wildlife, from amphibians to birds to mammals. So yeah, if you're listening and something's not right, get in touch with those guys and see if they can offer any advice. Hopefully, if a new fungal disease that infects newts or frogs or hedgehogs or whatever reaches our shores, we'll find out about it sooner rather than later.
We have one last question that I actually kind of have the answer to, because I did research into it a while ago, and it's actually from Alan James on Twitter. And he's actually asked who introduced the Iberian water frogs to the Avalon marshes, when and why did they choose that location? Well, it's not as simple as somebody, chose a time and location to actually release them. There's actually no records actually exist of when or how the frogs first arrived in Somerset. For anyone that doesn't know, the Avalon marshes is actually, it's quite a large area of wetland in Somerset around kind of Glastonbury Street area. Really, really important wildlife habitat for all manner of wildlife, from invertebrates, plants, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. But these frogs were actually well established by the 1990s, and quite a lot of research into it. Water frogs are quite a popular animal to have in the pet trade, apparently, and it may be a result of a deliberate release. It's also possible they were inadvertently introduced as eggs or small tadpoles during the translocation of fishes between fisheries. And it's certainly a possibility on the Avalon marshes, as several introductions of fish did occur soon after the Avalon marshes were established. And these particular frogs are confined to the Avalon marsh area, and they haven't really dispersed that much. So as far as I'm aware, it's the only place that has the Iberian water frog, and they have been DNA tested as well. So they do know that that's what they are. And if you go down there, if anyone's been down to Hamwell in particular, that's one of the places that the numbers are really high, and you hear the racket of frogs, that is the Iberian water frogs calling, and they do make a massive amount of noise. So hopefully that's answered Alan's question for him. To the best of my knowledge, they aren't anywhere else in the country. I know there's a population of pool frogs not too far from me as well.
Yes, that's one of the 4 species we haven't covered tonight. So there's the xenopus toad, which is a fully aquatic one, and there's the 4 water frogs, isn't there? There's the Perez frog, or Spanish marsh frog as it's sometimes called, the marsh frog, pool frog, which is native but went extinct. Some of that have been introduced aren't native, and very confusing. And the edible frog, which even more confusingly is actually a hybrid species between the marsh frog and the pool frog. And that's just a minefield we're not going to cover when we're this late into the podcast.
We'll save it for another day when it's a bit rainy outside and all 3 of us are ready to talk frogs again.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that again.
But it's probably worth saying though, because it's something that does, I don't know if you see it quite a lot, Steve, but I get a lot of people asking me questions, or it's something that comes up quite a lot on social media when people are looking at, people are so desperate to have frogs and frog spawn in the garden, which is lovely, and I think that's great that people want to embrace it and have them, this wildlife in their garden. But instead of just waiting for the wildlife to come, people are offering frog spawn from their ponds to move around. There's a lot of people saying about moving frog spawn from one pond to another, and it's just not a good idea at all.
No, of course not. You can spread disease. So rhinovirus is a disease affecting our amphibians, and has been forecast to only become more prevalent in the UK with climate change, and spreading born tadpoles and individuals between ponds is only going to make things worse. Also, because I've seen this online as well, particularly on sites like Gumtree, is people offering spawn and frogs for money. Just a reminder, guys, it's illegal to trade any of our native reptiles and amphibians. If you see this, do report it, and just stay away. If you build it, they will come, as the adage goes. You just have to be a little bit patient. And I know from building ponds myself, especially with conservation projects, and you expect the animals to be there instantly, sometimes the pond just needs to mature slightly and go through a few different phases of succession before the amphibians move in. So resist temptation and just be patient.
Just let them come. I mean, when we built our little pond in this garden, it didn't take long for the frogs to find it. We also have toads that use the pond. When we get the really hot summers, if you go out at night, the toads are sitting on the edge of the pond. We actually have a little cute little blush coloured toad that sits there. Quite adorable little guy actually. But they will come, but you just have to let them do it of their own accord. Like Steve was saying, please don't transfer spawn between sites. But it's really good to actually record it as well. So if you have got spawn in your ponds, do go on and record it. And
Yeah,
I've recorded mine today on the amphibian and reptile site, and you can just go on and you just put in the recording where it is and how much you've seen. But it's really good to know. We get an idea of kind of timings, what's spawning when up and down the country. So yeah, if you've got spawn, please do report it as well.
And just a word of advice to people: if my ramblings about amphibians have sounded like it's something that you want to get involved with, please do go online and find where your local amphibian and reptile group is, your local ARG, and volunteer some time with them through monitoring amphibians, through patrolling toad crossings, through managing habitats, etc., and trying to do as much as we can to save local reptiles and amphibians, because unfortunately over the past 60 years they've had a really hard time, and it's going to take a monumental effort from all of us to reverse those declines and try to help the little guys. It doesn't help that they have an image problem as well, but we can overcome that together, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of people say to me they love frogs and hate toads. And it's like, obviously there is a difference, but what's wrong with you? Yeah. Why don't you love toads? But welcome them both, and they're actually great species to have in your garden. They're great natural pest controllers in your garden, especially if you grow your own kind of fruit and veg and stuff. It's just making those little spaces for them, and everyone could do a little bit in their own gardens, or like Steve was saying, help out with local toad patrols, surveys, conservation efforts. Frog Life have a great list of toad patrols, and actually if you go on, I think both their Twitter and their Facebook pages, they're always posting toad patrols that need more volunteers. So if there's one that pops up in your area, even if you can just give 1 or 2 nights, it is an amazing, it does help so much.
I was going to bring that up, well done. Just to add to what both you guys have said, the ARG groups tend to be sort of county based. So there's Steve's heavily involved in the Cambridge ARG. I'm heavily involved in the Essex ARG.
And we have RAGS, which is Reptile Amphibian Group for Somerset.
Yeah. So sometimes it's usually the county first letter of the word, and then ARG, or the other way, like you said, RAG. Kent is K-RAG, so they've done it the other way around. But it's just, if you put in your county and amphibian reptiles, it should come up. We'll finish the show. Quick vote: frog or toad? What's your favourite out of the two?
I'm gonna say, although a midwife toad isn't a true toad, it sways it for me. It's a toad.
So team toad for you, Vic.
Do I have to choose?
Yes, you do. Frog Lady Vic, have to choose between your children.
Are we talking UK species or worldwide?
Oh, definitely UK species.
UK. I'd probably have to go for toads because of the sheer characterfulness that they display during the breeding season. When they're kicking each other off, and they're just great. So I think I'm going to go toad.
See, I absolutely adore marsh frogs, but do you know what? I grew up in a house where we had toads. And like you say, they always look grumpy, but in a very friendly, grumpy way, like a children's Disney film character. It's just a grumpy character, don't they? Yeah, I'm going to go Team Toad as well. So that's 3 for 3 for the toads. So sorry, frogs.
We still love you. We do still love you.
Do you know, maybe we should do a poll. See what the listeners prefer out of all these.
I will put it, once this podcast's gone live, I'm going to put a poll on our Twitter.
Yeah,
and I'll run it, and you basically pick Team Frog or Team Toad.
I think it's time to wrap it up. We've been going for a while. So, Steve, would you like to tell us your Twitter handle, etc.? Where can people find you online?
Just Google my name and I will appear. So my Twitter handle is most of my name. So it's at Steven Allain, and the same for Instagram. And so if you want to know more about what I do, what I get up to, or got any questions, feel free to find me on the socials and shoot me a message there. And hopefully I've infused some of you to get more actively involved with reptile and especially amphibian conservation in your local area.
Yeah.
And what we'll do is we'll actually put your social media handles, we'll put them on the website, and we'll put them on the UK Wildlife Podcast social media channels as well. So people, you can find Steve through us as well.
Yeah,
wonderful.
Right, people that haven't found us through the socials, as Steve put it. So UK Wildlife Podcast search for UK Wildlife Podcast on Facebook and it should come up. On Twitter, we're UK Wildlife Pod, and we're on Spotify now. I think I mentioned that in the last podcast. We're up to about 70 followers on there now. If you like to listen to us, but we're not on the network you want us to be on, let me know, and I'll just put us on there basically. But I think I've covered most of the major ones now. Do you want to do your personal ones, Vic?
Yeah, so I just did social media ones, so you can find me at VixPics, which is VIKSPICS. You can follow me on Frog Lady Vic as well, but that is purely Frog and Toad. I don't post anything that isn't Frog and Toad. It's just that. And you can also follow my ongoing project, Forgotten Little Creatures, which is, if you just type in Forgotten Little Creatures, it will come up.
I'm UK_wildlife and Pomman UK, all one word, on Twitter. And again, search for UK Wildlife page or Pomman page on Facebook. It should come up. Vic has some workshops if you want to go and join her on photography workshops too. So
yeah, they're all now live on my website, and you can actually search them through the RSPB Handwall site as well now.
And we haven't mentioned your book in the last few as well, so have a look at that as well. That's quite a good book. Quick bit of Vic news. Did you want to talk about your book sales quickly? I don't know if you mentioned that in the last one.
I am now, so I've actually had a really, really good year so far this year, and we're only kind of mid-February. I'm actually now only 3 books away from 500, from having sold 500, which is 2/3 of the print run.
Round of applause. Well done.
So really, really happy with that. So thank you, everyone. And I've actually just posted a book to Australia. So thank you very much to the person in Australia that's purchased that book. It's on its way. It will arrive.
Yeah, so there's plenty of frog pictures in that book as well, isn't there?
There is a lot of frogs. And actually, there's quite a bit about the Iberian water frogs, because that's obviously my local patch. So there's actually a little bit in there about them as well.
And when I finally write my book, there'll be plenty about frogs and toads in it as well. When I finally write it. Well, I think it's sign off time. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Steve.
Thank you so much. It's been really,
You're
really
welcome,
interesting.
guys.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely have you back on again.
Sounds great. I shall count down the days.
Yeah, we have other neurons and all the newts to talk about as well.
I
Not to mention the reptiles.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't forget the snakes and lizards and everything as well. All those
We'll do one in snakes in the summertime, I think, a bit more. Okay, well, thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, take care.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.